You're going to hear from Saran in a minute. We do a little tag team on this. It used to be the case when I first started working here in state government that we would actually have a budget address in one of the chambers. Pro Tem remembers those days. It was pretty boring. And budgets can be a little bit boring. I remember when I was in graduate school, I found the budgeting and finance classes to be just that, kind of boring. Little did I know that they were among the more important things that we do. And in fact, probably the most important thing. My former boss, the president now, when he was Senator Biden, used to like to say, don't tell me what your priorities are, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what your priorities are. And that's what we're about to present to you this morning, which is the budget that represents our priorities. One of the biggest priority that we have is, with respect to our budget in particular, is to have a strong and sustainable budget, with the emphasis being on sustainable, and I'm going to walk you through that in a minute. Part of that is starting with good revenue estimates, and we have the chair of our Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Committee with us representing that committee. They do an extraordinary job working through first in the fall and in December, giving us an estimate that we can work on, and then working through the spring as JFC meets and the legislature considers the budget to come with a 50-50 estimate about what kind of revenues we're going to have. Wasn't always that way. And when we go to the rating agencies, it's one of the things that they congratulate us for, because it doesn't happen always that way in other states. When I was first elected, I walked into the governor's office looking at about a $350 million deficit. And if you look back over 30 or 40 years or more, you see that it's not atypical. It comes every several years. It's the result of an economic downturn or some other thing happening in the economy that affects the revenues of the state. And so the state and the governor and the legislature at the time is confronted with pretty hard choices, as we did back in 2017 with raising taxes and cutting spending, and it's not good for anyone. And so we decided that we wanted to do things differently. And as it turns out, the rules that were established in the mid-'70s by then Governor DePon and his team, and changed a little bit over the years from that, really is what puts us in this situation from time to time where we are appropriating, as I call it, appropriating into a revenue bubble. And so when you do that, and here's how it works, right? The legislature, we get an estimate as to what the revenues are, and the legislature, the governor can present a budget that spends 98% of that limit. And when you do that, you end up appropriating into bubbles. And this is what our recent history looks like. So under the old rules, the revenues and the expenses kind of track one another because they have to based on the rules. We changed the rules. We had a proposal for a constitutional amendment to do that, to establish what we called budget smoothing. It was a recommendation from a lot of different folks that came out of the Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Committee and sanctioned by that committee. And instead of using the 98% limit of available revenues to target it to some other metric, which we call the spending benchmark. And so that's the blue line that you see there. And it really charts a course in between the ups and downs of our revenue. And you can see after the pandemic hit in 2019, in fiscal year 19, we had a high level of revenue growth at that time, and then it dropped off the table. But we followed our benchmark. You all in the legislature, everyone that's here in this room, approved a budget that was kind of in between, as you can see there. What we've experienced lately, and the rebound from COVID-19, is an acceleration in our revenue to a point revenue growth that we've never seen in a long, long time. So under the old rules, you could appropriate 98% of that number, whatever it gets to be. And if you do, you set yourself up for a really bad problem in the future, because as you can see, the the revenue estimates already for the out years are going down. So thanks to our DFAC, you're going to hear from Secretary of Finance in a minute. So here's our approach. Used to be fully fund the rainy days fund, 5% of anticipated revenues. Actually, it's real money. It's not a hedge against an estimate. At the beginning of the year, the Department of Finance transfers 5% of those revenues into a rainy day fund account. It's never been touched, by the way. There are limitations around how it can be used, but it's never been touched, which goes to our approach, which creates a different reserve account that could be touched in future years. Next would be the 98% limit. It's kind of irrelevant now when we have revenues at such a high level. So we target our budget growth to the DFAC benchmark. And in the last couple of years, as you saw from the last slide, it's been somewhere around 4 to 5% or thereabouts. And we go over it a little bit or we come in under it a little bit. It's really a target, right? The target for this year is 6.1%. And we've made policy decisions to go beyond that. 6.1% because of inflationary things happening in the economy, that type of thing. So once you fund your operating budget benchmark, any money above that becomes one time and falls into our Budget Stabilization Act, which is our fund, which is now $421 million. That's more than the rainy day fund. So when you consider the two of them together, you're close to $1 billion of reserves, which when you go back to the graph before, when that revenue goes south on us, we will have that reserve account to go to so that we don't have to raise taxes or cut spending like we have in the past. And then, of course, we're putting significant amounts of money over that benchmark into our capital improvements program. In addition, this year, and it's been usually the case historically, that governors have looked at a situation where they have a lot of excess revenue and have some reduction in that revenue, some tax policy. And we have a small tax cut here in this proposal that fundamentally goes to people who are on the margin of working or not working, and make it just a little bit more beneficial for them to go back to work. The one thing you're going to see in this budget, there's a real focus on providing additional compensation and other accommodations in terms of childcare for folks that need to go to work. Because the biggest problem in our economy right now is we've got more job openings than people looking for work. And we have, because of that competition, we have workers who are moving from one employer to another. And so as a state, we've had to raise salaries to compete with other employers as well, and you'll see that. So Rick, why don't you come in and explain briefly the tax policy.
So when we looked at what are the best ways that we can support working families and workers in Delaware, particularly in lower incomes and middle incomes, the best way to do that is through these two tools that are at our disposal, the standard deduction and the earned income tax credit. So what we're proposing to do is to increase the standard deduction by 75% to $5,700, or if you're a joint filer, $11,400, and that would be effective next tax year. And then for the coming tax year, the tax year we're in right now, to expand the refundability of the earned income tax credit. That's building on something that was done a few years ago, where we previously the earned income tax credit had no refundable component. We created it so that 4.5% could be refundable, and this proposes lifting that to 7.5%. You can see what the costs are in the budget that the governor's proposing, $25 million this year, but the full value of the package is about $55 million. Importantly, this is going to make it easier for filers. There's going to be about 50,000 Delawareans, most of them people who probably take the standard deduction at the federal level and then at the state level need to itemize. It'll get rid of that need to do the special itemization at the state level. So 50,000 tax filers will see a lot of simplification. And there'll be about 20,000 tax filers who will literally drop off the tax rolls of the state because their tax liability will go to zero. Some of them may continue to file taxes in order to get the refundable earned income tax credit. Importantly, what you see at the bottom here is, we're really hitting our target here. 80% of the residents of the 372,000 people who are going to benefit from this tax package. 80% of them have Delaware adjusted gross income below 75,000.
So again, a mechanism to help workers there at the margin, moving around from one employer to another, making it more beneficial to go to work. So here are the big numbers. We start after the revenue policy. And by the way, we thought about other tax cut that we might consider. And when I compared doing another smaller tax cut opposite a higher raise for our teachers or for state employees, it just felt like we'd get a better bang for our taxpayer buck in doing it and raising the teacher salary than additional tax cut that probably would be not very meaningful for most folks. And so that's some of the thinking. Remember, all this, going back to what I said at the beginning about priorities, all of this, lots of good things that we can do. The question is, what are your priorities and how do you make decisions among very beneficial things for our state? So here are the big buckets, almost $5.5 billion of the operating budget. So that's 7.4%. You heard me say that it's above our benchmark, and it's really fundamentally above the benchmark because of those salary increases in education and the second year of a increased salary policy for state employees. If you'll remember, we start with that about 9% at the very bottom of the scale. So we're moving everybody within this budget that's full-time merit system employees up to $15 or above, consistent with what's happening, ahead of what's happening in the following up on legislation from Senator Walsh and folks in this room. There you go. On the capital projects, you can see we're only borrowing about $300 million. General obligation bonds, 251. The other is a bond premium that is essentially cash that we don't have to borrow against, and we're putting $664 million into the cash into the bond bill. So again, one of the largest capital budgets in the history of our state. Last year, I think, was the biggest. Putting lots of people to work on important projects. One-time supplemental, that's mostly health care in that particular line item, and Saran will talk a little bit more about that. So we've got our 5% rainy day fund, and then our Budget Stability Act of $421 million. This is just a different way of representing what you just saw compared to last year. The big buckets: budget, one-times, grant and aid, capital, which includes transportation, again, almost $1.5 billion. OPEB, that's our investment in our long-term liabilities. You've probably heard a lot about that. It's mostly about obligations that we have in healthcare for state retirees, and then our Budget Stabilization Act that we just talked about a minute ago. In terms of priorities, strengthening our economy, we do, again, fund those tools that we use to create jobs and keep jobs here. Huge investment in public education, including early childhood education. That's also supporting families and workforce. And then significant investments in protecting our environment. On that side, with respect to water and wastewater, those types of programs, we are combining a lot of federal money. Sean Garvin, I see, has a big smile on his face back there. We've got lots of projects that we'll be able to fund with our water and wastewater revolving loan funds. So here are the big items. There are big priorities here: compensation and pay equity for state employees. Huge increase for our classroom teachers. Opportunity funding, you remember that, we're plussing that up to about $55 million. That goes to all schools with low income and disadvantaged populations, English learners. Affordable housing, one of the things that we're hearing, particularly more and more in Sussex County, Representative Briggs King and Senator Wilson, you hear it, and particularly down the eastern side, workers, folks that go to work every day and that they don't have a place to live that they can afford, and we're seeing that across our state. So again, a lot of workforce support there in the affordable housing area. Continued support for economic development, infrastructure. I mentioned the clean water and other environmental initiatives. So here are the big buckets in public education: 9% raise for teachers, 3% for all education workers, consistent with the 3% general increase for state employees, although the average of the increase for merit system employees is 6%, similar to what we did last year. Again, an increase in $15 million to opportunity funding, up to $53 million. We made a commitment 2 or 3 years ago to get to $60 million there. That's real money to those schools where they can, and everyone's doing a little bit different. You heard me talk about it in my State of the State, and that's, I think, a really good thing, as long as we make sure that they're evaluating their programs as to how well they're doing in getting our children to read proficiently at 3rd grade and do math, middle school, and graduate on time and ready for college. The Wilmington Learning Collaborative, we've added some money there to help with the launch of that. We're really excited about big moves here with early childhood education. You can see we've increased the purchase of care rates. These are dollars that go for lower income children so that they can, so that the daycare facilities can take them into their facilities. We've also expanded eligibility for that purchase of care, and then we've doubled the funding for ECAP. Those are programs in our public schools for 3- and 4-year-olds, children with disabilities mostly, but a really important program. And then House Bill 33, Representative Kim Williams is here, is excited about that. Just the student-teacher ratios for preschool special ed. So making sure that those kids can really get a good head start as they enter kindergarten and 1st grade. So here are some of the environmental initiatives. These are things that you're familiar with. $10 million for ag lands preservation and open space comes out of the real estate transfer tax. Clean water, we've added back money that was kind of taken away last year in addition to the federal money. You can see the little note there at the bottom. So this becomes a really big number, which is why Sean has got a big smile on his face back there. And a lot of this money goes to the lower part of our state where the need is great. And then the next, again, the tools we use for economic development. The graduation lab space and the site readiness funds have been really helpful as we tried to keep science and tech-based companies that need additional lab space as they grow, to grow here in Delaware and not move to Pennsylvania. We've had some real competition there with companies like Prelude, Chestnut Run, the facility there. They're developing additional lab space there, and just need to, we have a co-working space with UD and the new DuPont at the experimental station. So those companies, startup companies, science and tech-based companies, they're there at that facility. We want them to graduate out of that co-working space, but stay here in Delaware. And these tools enable us to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to Saran. He's going to get into some of the details, starting with the money that we're putting towards pay policy. And I'd like you to take a close look at these next 2 slides, and you'll see that we put an incredible amount of money into healthcare for employees, healthcare for retirees, healthcare for lower income folks with through Medicaid. Won't be in the next slide, but it's part of it as well. And so those dollars that we have to divert to healthcare are dollars that can't go into their paychecks of our state employees. And it's something to just think about, something that I think about. Same thing with retirees. If we have a big retiree health number, that means it's a number that we can't put to increase their pension checks. Saran?
Thank you, Governor. For starters, let me say I'm losing my voice. I've been talking a heck of a lot lately the last couple of days, so I apologize in advance. So as the governor mentioned, I think it's important to, when we start talking about these pay increases, that we say historic before we say them. There's a lot of members of the General Assembly who can remember time periods where we were not able to do pay increases at all. And in some cases, most of the time, it's pay increases for state employees have landed in the 1%, 2% range. This year, we'd be recommending a 3% pay increase for all state employees. We'd also be looking at a shift of our merit scales. Our merit scales, individuals who are not collectively bargaining for their wages. and looking at a 3 to 9%, depending on their pay grade, pay increase for those individuals. Obviously, we know that that has an impact on our collectively bargaining units. It will raise their floor when they come forward to negotiate, and that should help to lift all boats. Obviously, we're competing with the Amazons and the McDonald's of the world when it comes to employees, and there are a lot of vacancies that we see in areas like the kids department and DHSS and corrections. And so this is a strategy to address that. So obviously, recruitment and retention initiatives are included in this budget on top of that. We also established a $15 minimum wage. The administration started out at the beginning of the governor's term with the goal of trying to get all employees above the federal poverty level. We've essentially accomplished that goal, and then the goal moved to $15 an hour. And so with this budget, we would bring all full-time state employees up to $15 an hour. Next slide. So as the governor mentioned, if you remember the last slide, it was $147 million for the historic pay increases, which also included a 9% raise for educators, so they get the 3% that everybody else does, and an added 6% bump on top of that. And that is still less than what we're going to be setting aside to address healthcare needs throughout state government. So we're looking at $143.2 million deficit when it comes to the group health insurance plan. And also we set aside $50 million of one-time extraordinary revenues to address our OPEB liability that's included in that. Another thing that's not included on this slide, though, that's also in the one-times, the federal Medicare assistance program, which was expanded during the pandemic, requires some one-time costs from the state to address the expansion of our enrollment. A lot of that is included in our one-times as well to address that population that we've had to add in since the pandemic, and that's just under $70 million. So you're looking at $263 million in the one-time that is just healthcare related, a huge amount. We also, in this budget, fully fund the 2021 market rate study for purchase of care. So an effort to try to expand our roles by getting more individuals into these facilities to service this population. We also are recognizing an $8 million federal grant, preschool development grant. The governor has been laser focused on the idea of trying to impact early childhood education to prepare our students for kindergarten. And, our system that we have for early childhood education, I don't think anybody would claim that it is operating in the way that we would like. And so our hope is that the $8 million federal grant that we will receive would give us some good research and understanding to hopefully, as I've been saying, build a better mousetrap when it comes to early childhood education. This also includes, as the governor mentioned before, doubling of the Early Childhood Assistance Program, ECAP, which obviously is dedicated to 3- and 4-year-olds prior to them jumping into elementary school. And then $3.9 million for, as we mentioned, Representative Williams' bill, which the administration supports to lower student-teacher ratios for preschool special ed students. For our colleges and universities, we have set aside $60 million in the capital budget, $20 million each for their deferred maintenance and other capital costs. All 3 universities have very strong and ambitious capital plans over the next few years, and our hope is that this helps them get closer to those goals. It also includes funding for University of Delaware's First State Promise Scholarship for high needs students, as well as seed investments. Obviously, that is for Del Tech and University of Delaware, and Inspire for Delaware State University, all increases based on increased enrollment in those programs. So opportunity funding. Again, the governor being laser focused on education since this administration started, really set out to try to figure out a weighted student funding model, and opportunity funding is that. This year we have set aside $50 million. The goal is to get to $60 million by FY25. And so as you can see, we've been funding that program a little bit ahead of the schedule that we've set. So we should be at $60 million, obviously, by next fiscal year. $30 million for mental health services for elementary and middle school students. This was HB 100, HB 300 that was introduced all by Representative Longhurst. $2 million to support recommendations for Family Services Cabinet Council. Family Services Cabinet Council is an effort to really bring together the agencies in state government who have direct impact on youth and their families. And the Governor's Summer Fellowship Program and statewide mentoring coordinator efforts are a part of that. I don't know if you want to
stop you there. One of the big challenges that we have now is the pandemic caused a lot of lost learning among our children. It's a really serious challenge and problem for all of us. So what we've been trying to do is work with the school districts, encourage them to have stronger, more robust summer programs, and that's what these the $2 million there for our fellowship programs. Essentially, we got seniors in high school, students to sign up to be part of this. We pay them a stipend. They work with the children, work with the schools, and essentially try to work on this lost learning issue with the younger children in particular, in terms of getting them reading and working on their math, and obviously having some fun at the same time. It's really a tough lift because a lot of, parents and families have other things to do in the summertime, but it's the only time, that and after school, where we actually have extra time to help these students, and it's something that we all need to lean into. The program itself, the students that signed up, they were fantastic, and they were a great asset to our schools across the state. I visited a lot of the programs. We were able, by paying the teachers a little bit extra, we're able to get them to, instead of taking maybe the summer off a little bit, to come and participate as well. It's a big focus for us as we try to address that lost learning.
So we mentioned before investments in our environment and agriculture. Our cover crop program has been very important for our farmers and down in Sussex and Kent, and in some places in Newcastle County as well. Teddy, Tree for Every Delawarean initiative. I love the name of this program, I'm sorry. But Governor's initiative to plant 1 million trees throughout the state of Delaware. We've set aside funding to get us closer to that goal. DNREC and the Department of Agriculture are leading the charge on that, but obviously, if anybody can get out there and plant a tree, go for it.
We need your help.
We need your help. Also, $2.9 million supports lead assessment remediation. Obviously, that has been a topic of discussion most recently. $2 million will be in one-time initiatives to support testing and other immediate needs, remediation and other immediate needs associated with lead, and then another $900,000 in ongoing funding for tracking and monitoring and those efforts. $101 million for housing. He's standing up.
American Rescue Plan to designate a lot of money. And this will go mostly to creating new units. As you all know, this is really, really expensive. And it traditionally has been primarily a federal responsibility. And the Delaware State Housing Authority has really been a conduit of those federal monies in addition to the housing authorities across the state. But increasingly over the last, 10 years or so, we've added additional Strong Neighborhoods programs and other housing programs in our communities. And this is an opportunity, you'll see some of the programs that Eugene Young and his team are working on to really lean into this. Is it enough? It's not, because it's very, very expensive, but it will give nonprofit agencies across our state that are working on this additional resources so that we can create more units. This does not support folks that are marginally housed at the moment, right? So our people that are experiencing homelessness, it's a very different problem, really trickier problem, because there are other issues associated with it in terms of mental health issues and substance abuse issues and underemployment and all that kind of stuff. but something else also that we're working on.
So let's break down this funding. So we're looking at $31.5 million in general fund dollars and another $60 million in ARPA funds that the governor has directed to these 4 initiatives. I think it's important to recognize that these 4 initiatives are not voucher programs, but instead are focused on expanding the capacity of affordable housing. Obviously, that is the true issue, is the actual affordability of housing. And so, you know, obviously we do have programs that are available that provide vouchers, and we want to continue to do that. But just provide, you're not going to voucher your way out of this problem. This is something where you're going to have to add capacity, and these programs do that. Partially through preservation. So we have many units that, especially in Kent and Sussex County, that were 30 years ago had federal tax credits in order to provide affordable housing. Those only last 30 years, and it's about 400 units that are about to eclipse that timeline. And once they do, they can go right back to market rate. So these funds are going to help to preserve those units for hopefully another 30 years to remain affordable housing units. Also, you have programs like the Catalyst Fund that are specifically dedicated to entities that actually develop affordable housing, so your habitats and groups like that. Then you've got another $10 million in the capital budget from the affordable housing programs and strong neighborhoods programs added to that, which bring us to $100 million. Next slide. The $1.5 million, though, is dedicated to policy initiatives that the administration is in full support of. One of those is the Landlord Mitigation Fund. I see Senator Lockman here and is a firm advocate of that. Also funding to support tenants' right to counsel, which is something that's been spearheaded in the Senate by Senator Townsend and others. And also the action to rent escrow, which is introduced by Representative Sherry Dorsey Walker, which this administration has also been in support of. So just going through some of these top numbers, $191 million in capital for school construction and renovation. As you guys may remember, the last couple of years we've been around $300 million for school construction. A lot of new projects. Obviously, inflation has become an issue right now, and so what we've decided to do is focus more on existing projects that we already have in our hopper and not really adding a lot of new things. Hopefully, when we come back in a couple of years or a year or two, some of the inflationary impacts are going to go down. We've been seeing inflation between 20 and 40% in some cases in a lot of our school projects, so a significant amount of money. Also, $25 million towards the strategic funds to support jobs in the state of Delaware, another $20 million for suburban roads in order to address some of our highest need roads in our state. Building strong communities, mentioned some of the housing programs that we had, the affordable housing program and strong neighborhoods, but this also includes new libraries. We received a lot of federal funding in ARP to support improvement of our library system throughout the state, and I think those have been very successful, and these dollars are going to go to match and leverage more of those funds. So this is, knocking on wood, hopefully the last installment for the Kent and Sussex County courthouses. This really, this $34 million here really just addresses some of the inflationary impact that we've seen, some of the original estimates that went out for those projects. But regardless of that, because of the strategy that the governor has used as a result of Executive Order 21, we've been able to forward fund a lot of projects very quickly. I think when this conversation really first started regarding these courthouses, we were looking at timelines that was over a decade to really get these done. And at this point, we should be ready to cut ribbons on those facilities, hopefully by next year. And then building strong communities, I'll just mention one project, building strong foundation for our state, the Delaware Hospital for the Chronically Ill down in Smyrna. If anybody's been there, serve a very, very high risk and that needs population, and that place is falling apart. Governor set aside ARPA funds to build a new facility, but we're gonna have to add some general funds to address inflation from that, and that comes up to about $33 million. Next slide. So just going through the numbers that the governor went through earlier, we got a $5.5 billion, just under a $5.5 billion budget, which represents about 7.4% growth. Obviously, to the governor's point, much of that related to pay for our state employees. But we feel very comfortable with going above the benchmark, given how much we've been able to set aside in budget stabilization to cover the shortfalls of any projections that we may have. Go back. Thank you. Just under a $1.3 billion capital budget, $664 million of that being cash, and a $324 million one-time supplemental, which, as I said, about $260 million of that being healthcare costs. You can jump now. All right.
So before we close it up, just wanted to go over real briefly again to remind you of the federal investments, both from the ARPA money, American Rescue Plan resources, and the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. Here are the buckets for ARPA. We talked about many of these. Saran mentioned the Home for the Chronically Ill, higher education there. We've got big projects in each of the universities and our college there across the board. People have asked us what's the status of these resources, and you can get more information. There we go. We get more information from the website here at de.gov/rescue plan. It'll tell you what the spending category is, how much of the money has already been utilized and expended. And then on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, here are the big buckets. The vast majority of the money goes to our existing programs in DelDOT, so the big $500 million number there for roads and bridges. We also have resources for ports and waterways, smaller amount for public transit, drinking water and wastewater. We've talked about that. Those are the resources that Sean will be utilizing. And then here's the website to find out more about those and to keep track of those, de.gov/BIL. We also have Greg Patterson, who's here. Greg, stand up so people who don't know you can see who you are. If you have any questions about the federal money and the status of each and the projects, there's a lot of detail there. And one of the things that folks are most interested in, we got $112 million for various capital programs, and including for community service organizations. A big chunk of that has already been approved for our libraries. I want to say $40 million has been approved for libraries on projects up and down their state, but we're still waiting approval for the rest of that money for projects that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So after this presentation, I hope that I don't have to tell you what our priorities are, because you've seen them right here in our budget. And that's essentially our priorities. We've tried to work them through with what we know are priorities of members of the legislature. In each of those categories, there are groups of legislators going to the whole of both bodies that support what we're doing. We now have the schedule here. We've gone through the July to December development of the budget, and again, thanks to Mike Houghton, the chair of DFAC, and his group for their revenue estimates. This is the proposed 24 recommended budget that we're presenting today. Now we're going to have our JFC meetings February, March, markup in April and May, and hopefully approval of the budget before June 30th. So I want to thank legislators who are here in particular for being here and for your support. We look forward to working with you over the next several months. I want to thank again Saran and his team at OMB for all the work that they did putting this together. All our partners across, including higher ed and community service organizations that we work very closely with. This is really a big team effort. A lot of people had a hand in putting this together, and this is another step along the way. So again, thanks for being here this morning. We will be available for media for questions after we close it up, and again, look forward to working with you. Thanks very much. One thing I forgot, Pam and Heather, come out here and take a bow for our sign language for the deaf and hard of hearing.